Happy Thursday. Happy Thursday, Stand Up Nation. Another week in the books. Well, for this class, you know what I mean. Um, and I'm here to talk to you about Bill Hicks. Um, One of my personal favorites. Uh, and from your comments, you guys seem to like him too. I hope you're not just saying you like him because you think you have to. Um, in the comments, like if you don't, you can say that. Some of you say you don't like, well, Dyson Kinnison. I don't think any of you were bullshitting me in there in those comments. Um, yeah, so I want to talk about Bill Hicks here for a little bit, and some of the stuff again is from class. We had a good discussion in class about him, and by the way, all every your class has been really good. Like discussions have been great. Responses online have been great. So keep that going because it makes these COVID times that much more bearable, at least for me. Hopefully for you guys too. Um, a lot of comparisons in your comments and just the documentary that we watched between Hicks and Carlin. Um, and I think they did. There's a lot of similarities between the two. Um, but one is it's just a ride, right? That whole the kind of thread that runs through that documentary is Bill Hicks being like, it's just a ride. Like we're here, enjoy enjoy the ups and the downs, and it's similar to Carlin's. If you go back and look at that little interview they did with him, he talks about the freak show, like everybody gets a ticket to the freak show, and some people are in it, and some people get to write and talk about it, and that's what I do. Like those two things to me are really similar in like their approach to everything. And all you guys, there's so many connections between just their not their styles, but their approach to comedy. Um, the one about yeah, a couple of you made this connection. They care about the things that they're sort of criticizing, right? Um, who was the quote? Comedians? No, that's not one. Um, who said it? I like that you guys picked quotes out from the documentary that kind of ring true, but I talked about it in here. I think to you guys, like we're critical of the things we love the most. Who said that? That was Sean was talking about that. To say that that is, you know, that's wrong to be critical of the government or religion or whatever is, kind of a weak stance to take. Because for the most part, they talk about he was very critical of the South and his upbringing and all that kind of stuff. But it. It's out of love. It's out of and Carlin was the same. We expect more of these things, right? Um, because they're ours, and we, you know, we want them to be the best. I've made my example is always my kids. I'm super critical of my kids because and they're the thing I love the most, right? Because you want them to have a better life than you. You want them to be as good as they can be, whatever they're being. So there's a lot of Carlin connections, um, and I like the way you guys in your comments were connecting him to different. And this is part of the course. Like what's fun about the course is making these connections, like connecting him to Kinnison and Dice Clay and Lenny Bruce, and it's uh, I love seeing it. Um, so like I said, some of this stuff I'll be reiterating from class, from my class notes and things like that. So my apologies if you were there and you're hearing stuff again. Um, Ideas should be shocking, not antics, right? That's, if nothing else, Hicks, pairing Hicks with Kinnison and Dice should very clearly, um, should very clearly help you define comedy versus good comedy, right? That sort of the murky definition that I've been trying to shape for you the whole semester should be, um, crystal clear after after last week and seeing those two performances, right? What's shocking about Bill Hicks is his ideas and his thinking, not his antics, right? Not his ranting and raving and misogyny and homophobia and all these ignorance and things like that. And that's important, obviously. Um, he's also it also brings up one of these old stand-up dichotomies, which is like there are people who say funny things, and there are people who say things funny, and that's almost a good comedy versus comedy uh, analogy right there, and that's existed for years. It's been around for years, but the people who say funny things is good comedy. The people who say things funny is just, yeah. Like, perfect example is Kinnison or Dice Clay. His whole shtick. Gabriel Iglesias, perfect example. He says things funny, right? So it's like thought versus antics, ideas versus antics, and that, I think, Bill Hicks typifies, or at least crystallizes that disparity, um, pretty well. Better just seeing it. Like for me, I feel like if you just see it, like we did this week, see the disparity between the two. That's that's that will go further towards you guys understanding what I'm talking about than me trying to explain it for the last 5 minutes. That makes any sense. Um, he was kind of Hicks. I always look at him as like he was kind of his reset button for comedy in the at the end of the '80s into the '90s, um, because the comedy of the '80s was typically like the two ends of the spectrum. It was either Dice and Kinnison and Murphy, just like shock comedy for shock's sake, which again just has a short shelf life that we've kind of discussed that. But the other end of it was the Seinfeld type comedy. What's the deal with the observational humor? What's the deal with airplane food? Right. So those were the two sort of competing styles in the '80s, and those were a distinct departure from the Carlin Pryor, you know, sort of exploding out of the Lenny Bruce. Uh, you know, Lenny Bruce does his thing, and then Carlin and Pryor really like '70s, '60s, more of the '70s into the '80s. They took that and ran, and then the '80s sort of split off into these two factions, right? Shock for shock's sake, and what's the deal with? Did you ever notice like that kind of stuff? So Hicks seems to me like a reset button. It's like, what the fuck are we doing here as a community, as a stand-up comedy community? What are we doing? I don't want to be either of those things, right? We need to get back to our roots or whatever. The search for truth. I said it's a return to the search for truth. Fuck this shit about, you know, noticing mundane things about our lives. And fuck this shit about just saying the most, you know, shocking thing we can think of just to say it because we can. Like let's get back to the search for truth. And he kind of hit the reset button for comedy at the end of the 80s. And that that just, it was a wake up call. It was like, you know, holy shit, what are we doing as comedians? Like, what is this for? Because again, wrapped up in all of that was this movement towards everybody was doing stand up. Like, if you had a bar or a restaurant or whatever, like, one, comedy clubs were popping up everywhere. But even if you weren't, if you were just a restaurant or a bar or something, they'd have a comedy night and put a fucking mic in the corner and people would go up and do it. And there was a huge comedy boom in the 80s. But most of it was driven by this sort of the material side of it. It's like, oh, they weren't in it for the comedy. I think we talked about that. Comedy was an end for Bill Hicks, right? That somebody said that in the documentary. Comedy was an end for him. Like, he didn't want the big movie deal. He didn't want to be famous. He didn't want a TV show where he could come up with a catchphrase and ride it into, you know, retirement. Comedy was the end for him, where for so many in the 80s, it was just a stepping stone. It was just get on late night TV, get a TV show, get a movie deal, get a book thing, da 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 da. And Eddie Murphy was a perfect example of that, right? That was his trajectory. And everybody was chasing that. A lot of people, that makes for a lot of disingenuous comedy when your motives or your goals are anything less than telling the truth, seeking the truth. So that was that was an important part of that documentary. Was Hicks stand up was an end for him. Like, that's what he wanted to be. Nothing more, nothing less. He talks a lot about his material. If you really look at it, it kind of winds, a lot of it winds back to this idea that complacency will eventually lead to our demise. Like, if we continue to just blissfully float through space, allowing religion and the government and society or culture to just dictate our lives and just basically take it up the ass, this experiment's not going to work, right? Talks a lot about that. A lot of his jokes are pointed at a, you know, a culture that, again, back to Carlin, would rather coast with the bullshit than grapple with the truth, right? You are free to do as we tell you. You are free to do as we tell you. The illusion of freedom, which Carlin again talks about. So I think that's something that's important to take away. Like, we're complicit in this, in a lot of this, because it's just easier to, right, sit down and watch TV and forget about everything else that we should be thinking about, that he is asking us to think about. Again, humor only asks us to think, right? Um, Talking about the gray areas. Someone brought that up. Who mentioned that? Mm-hmm. Cole. This. Not the black and the white, right? The middle. I talk a lot about the middle, right? If life is just a series of spectrums, and the ends are usually the worst of each side, but if we took the best from each side, you'd end up somewhere in the middle, right? Moving forward, that's the gray areas. Like that's a even put middle in parentheses there to remind myself. That's good. Um, a bunch of you commented on this, like his shock. He was trying to shock us into paying attention, basically, and the way he used it, like, cause he loses his mind on stage. He'll scream and yell, but it's to a point. It's to emphasize something. It's it doesn't feel like a gimmick. Let's put it that way. And in the way it does with Kinnison, where it was just like it was all yelling and some jokes. This was jokes and then yelling at appropriate times, sort of, and I think naturally angry, like that kind of stuff. Whereas I mentioned Lewis Black in class a couple weeks ago. Like his whole shtick is the whole, I'm so irate, but it doesn't feel organic. It's like he writes. If you looked at his set written, he probably wrote it out. Oh, yell this, that kind of takes away from the impact that it can have when it feels like premeditated. I guess it doesn't feel premeditated with Hicks. Like when he's taking you through those bits and he's building and then he's screaming, you're like, oh shit, he's really pissed about this. this means something to him. And those are really impactful jokes. The one that is that stands out is his bit about the New Kids on the Block versus like Jimi Hendrix or whatever. I want my artists to, believe in what they're doing and to play with heart and yeah. And everyone's like, oh, the new kids and they're so clean and wholesome and that's what our kids need. Like, no, our kids don't need banality and mediocrity. Like, that's what we're teaching our kids now. And if you guys know Bo Burnham, I talked about this last week in class, but there's Bo Burnham has his song Repeat Stuff, where it's a very similar concept. I would I would be willing to bet that 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 Bo Burnham song is based on the Bill Hicks bit, or at least is an homage to it. Bo Burnham seems like a student of comedy that would have seen that bit and would have seen a lot of Bill Hicks. But there's a couple things that sort of the filleting the microphone as if it was Satan's dick. They both do that, and that's something. Yeah, yeah. Hicks does it, um, implying that mainstream pop music is just sucking the dick of Satan, and Bo Burnham does the exact same thing in the song about the same concept of popular music. Um, And then the whole repeat stuff, right? Repeat stuff, repeat stuff. He does a whole, draws the connection between fascism and this idea of repeat stuff, repeat stuff. And Hicks does it as well with "You are free to do as we tell you," right? The using that mechanism to make the same kind of joke. So it's always fun to make connections like that. But this one seems to honor Hicks's humor and um, at the same time um, kind of move it forward. Um, what else do I got here? Christ at his angriest. That's one of my favorite lines. That's Brett Butler was the comedian who said that about him, right? Jesus in the temple condemning all of basically organized religion um, is what Hicks wanted to be. Like that's that's a pretty cool assessment to make. He had a similar preaching background or religious background as Kinnison did. Kinnison sort of notably made the connection between the two, and I think Hicks did it just sort of um, naturally. Not he wasn't. He never made. He never said this is. You know. He never said it, but I think he made the connection between the two more implicitly. Um, I wrote comedy should shake you. Like he almost has this disdain for his audience, right? He's certainly not pandering to anybody, um, or using gimmicks, but like comedy should shake you out of your everyday rote, just sort of hive mind, closed minded, um, you know, bullshit uh, lives. That's I think that's a primary function of comedy is to kind of knock you off your line, if you will. Um, and Bill Hicks certainly did that. Um, someone commented on this, and I'll get to your comments in a second, but the music thing, right? They talk about how Bill Hicks saw what was going on with music and tried to put where you put ideas into your songs to convey them to everybody else. And he wanted to do that with comedy. The same, and Carlin said the same thing in that interview. Carlin said, people like Bob Dylan are writing these songs about social change and uh, revolution. And he's like, that's what I want. That's what I wanted to do. That spoke to me. So why can't we do that with comedy? Um, and then the license to tell the truth line is a good one. Like comedians are one of the few. It's one of the few jobs where you know you're supposed to be telling the truth. And then that was Richard Jenny said that he's a comedian too. He was pretty big at the time. Um, he was saying, a lot of guys don't do it, and that's for me the responsibility opportunity relationship that we talked about before. Everyone has the opportunity to do it, so why not? But you certainly don't have to. You don't have a responsibility to do it. Um, people, yeah. His job was to break the spell, right? We're all sort of spellbound by the world around us and all the distractions, right? We're under a spell. And TV does it, movie does it, movies do it, and the media does it, and the government does it. We're entranced. Need to break the spell. So I'll get to your comments now, as I appreciate them greatly. Um, a lot of you talked about restraint, like, and I just was talking about this second ago. Like Courtney brought up the being loud and obnoxious, but to a point, right? It's not what your act was built on when necessary. And I think at the beginning I made that connection. right? It's not, it shouldn't be screaming, 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 joke. It should be joke, 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 screaming. um, and then Cole, um, you mentioned that you thought he was shocking for the way he challenged his audiences. And I like that. That was shocking. Um, and you also talked about the gray areas. Um, but yeah, he had this relationship with his audience where it was like, I'm not gonna be your monkey, right? I'm not just gonna be up here doing a dance. Like, I'm here to, I'm here to break the spell. I'm here to shake you. I'm here to sort of speak the truth, and or my truth. It's not telling you what the truth is, but you know what I mean. Um, so that was shocking. I think um, it was almost like, again, they talked about this, like he had almost a disdain for the audience, and it's like, you guys are part of the problem. Like, um, so yeah, that I like that point. Um, Ben wrote about telling the truth, seeking the truth. Like, those are, I think, fundamental comedic principles that a lot of people miss. Um, and especially at this time, like I said, the sorry, there's something in my fucking nose. Sorry, you guys have to be subjected to that. God damn it. I just had my COVID test, so. Ooh, I'll put the bonus word in now for you guys. Um, it's going to be COVID. Use the word COVID in your response to this post, and I'll hook you up with some extra cred. COVID is the bonus word for today. Um, Telling the truth, seeking the truth. Um, I don't know what else to say about that. Um, Jack Jack made this great point in connecting it with Lenny Bruce, and that he felt as though you felt as though their lives depended on them saying these things, right? We talked a lot about good comedy as something at stake, right? There's Lenny Bruce had it, and I don't think you see it really until Hicks. That feeling of he thought his life depended on, like, that's what these ideas and jokes and things meant to him. Like, you can't fake. I don't think you can fake that. I don't think you can create a character that has that kind of passion. That's got to be authentic. But that my Hicks's life depended on him performing these, right, and telling the truth and digging and looking for answers. Um, I liked that, um, and it's tied into the pandering thing I'm talking about. He's like, it's almost like he was on stage being like, I don't owe you anything, the audience. I'm not going to pander to you. He didn't need to prove anything to his audience. That's what Jack said. Doesn't owe his audience anything but the truth. What you do with it is up to you. If you don't like it, fuck you. Get the fuck out. That's your choice. But that, the stakes, I think, really important. Um, Shiraz brought up this idea of teaching versus preaching, which I really liked because you're not supposed to go to see Bill Hicks and just take his word as gospel. And this one hit different for me because I feel like that in class. Like, I don't want you guys to sit there and hear what I say and be like, oh, that's what I'm supposed to think now, or that's the truth. Like this is my truth. This is what I think and believe. I'm trying to teach you how to think like this and think differently and all that kind of stuff. And I think that's what Bill Hicks was trying to do. Made a clear line between teaching and preaching and how it can often be misconstrued or misunderstood as such. Like, I don't think he was preaching. I think he was teaching, and I thought that was a good connection to make. Um, Caitlin, Caitlin brought up the point that I just connected with Carlin, right? Doing with comedy what musicians do with music in many cases. I don't know how much music out there now is like that, but there was a lot of it going on in the 80s and the 90s, um, and just tapping into that I think was a vital um, idea. Sean, critical of the things we love the most, right? Like, I talked about that already. Drew mentioned how and a bunch of you mentioned, like, why haven't I heard of this guy? A lot of it was that he was saying things that people didn't want to hear about, especially about the Gulf War. Um, and dissent wasn't as applauded or as cool as it is now, right? So a lot of his stuff was really controversial. I know you guys with the 2021 lens looking back were like, oh, he's criticizing the war. Like, who doesn't do that now? Well, they didn't do it a ton in the, with the Gulf War. And Carlin does a lot of stuff about the Gulf War too. It's unfortunate that Hicks died, you know, so young. We didn't get to see what he would have done as, Carlin just built up his reputation. Carlin was bigger than a lot of that kind of that kind of censorship, like, or sweeping him under the rug. But yeah, dissent wasn't what it is now, where now there's marches and it's almost cool to shit on your government or your religion or whatever. Kaylee made the point. We talked about how Eddie Murphy and Dice Clay especially feel like defensive. Their comedy feels defensive. They're trying to protect something. Hicks was not that, right? He let go of all that. Like, this wasn't. No one was attacking him, and he's not attacking anyone. This is just a dialogue. It's a discourse. And then I'll leave you with this. Evan made this point. I thought it was nice. Hicks is what Kinnison thought he was. If that makes any sense, right? Like, Kinnison thought he was this, like, prophet, this, like, loudmouth prophet, but he wasn't. Like, he was kind of a cautionary tale. And Hicks, yeah, Kinnison thought he was Hicks, but Hicks was Hicks. I don't know. I'm done. All right. Hope you enjoyed this. I'll see some of you guys today and the rest on Tuesday. Bye.